الرحمن الرحيم الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر. Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome back. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to day number 2. It's a pleasure to see you all again, alhamdulillah. I'm just out of curiosity, how many folks are from Ohio? Wow, mashallah. Okay, so, and then everyone else is from out of town, I assume, yeah. Sorry we had to make you guys come all the way to Ohio. Ohio is a interesting place. One of the Ohioan ambassadors is here. Her name is Jana Al-Akhras. If you guys want to hear how amazing Ohio is and all the intellectual gymnastics that Ohioans get into to persuade you that it's the best state in the country, Jana Al-Akhras is the person to go to. Another thing, you guys saw yesterday how beautiful the Institute is. MashaAllah, it is. They've been working really hard on it. It does look incredible. You know, some people here work behind the scenes, don't get that much credit. Shireen Parsai, I don't know where she is. She's not in here right now, but she is the artistic mind, right? Am I wrong? Behind, you know, how beautiful it is. And you know, that's Cheyenne's sister, and their mother, Parveen over here, is a wonderful woman, incredible. She's the reason why I'm not allowed to insult Cheyenne on stage or anywhere. She's also a fantastic cook and has agreed to invite everyone for dinner tomorrow at her home for homemade Persian food. So please take advantage of that. It's amazing, alhamdulillah. All right. Let's get to know some people from the audience, I guess. So I'm going to come down. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. This is my friend Omar Malik right here, right? Coming from the UK. He just had a child a month and a half ago. MashaAllah, congratulations. But he's such a good husband and father. He left a month and a half-year-old baby, left his wife taking care of the child alone, to come here, mashallah. I don't know if that's a testament to, you know, the sheikh or a testament to his character. Allahu alam. All right, let's come over here. Assalamu alaikum. Can you please introduce yourself?
Assalamu alaikum. My name's Gulnaz and I'm from Scotland.
From Scotland, mashallah. I love Scotland. I lived there for a year, alhamdulillah. What's your favorite book?
Robert Burns.
All right, so it's not the Quran. Okay. MashaAllah. That's, did you listen to the tafsir? I mean, you know about the Quran, right? Like it's like one of the reasons why we're here and stuff. Alhamdulillah. All right, let's get over here somewhere. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. What's your name?
Victor.
Where are you from?
St. Louis.
MashaAllah. Why'd you come here?
I just wanted to finally meet the Usuli community.
All right. You listened to the khutbah yesterday, right? And we're supposed to be here for gratitude. So, not very impressed by the answers I'm getting so far. But alhamdulillah, we're here to learn. And that's to be expected. People will learn. Yeah, so we do have a wonderful, distinguished panel. But before we get to that, a couple of announcements. Again, prayer is in the room over there. Please make sure to take Sharif with you. He needs the prayer. What else am I supposed to announce? Lunch will be at 12:30. And we're going to do this panel now until 10 to 12:30, and then we'll go have lunch. And then afterwards, we'll have Dhuhr prayer. We're going to be doing a film screening preview at 2 o'clock. That's something that has been in the works for a long time, so really exciting stuff. And yeah, you guys are going to have to deal with me for, you know, the rest of the day. But the testimonials, yes. Okay, there's a film crew that's going around. And, please feel free to speak with them. They're trying to get testimonials from individuals. And don't say anything negative. It has to all be positive. That's one of the requirements. But besides that, yeah, that's it. Okay, so right now for our panel, we have a really distinguished, sorry? If you're a rich Egyptian, come talk to me. Okay, don't go talk to the sheikh. Come talk to me. I'm good at handling these types of things. And if you're wondering about what to do with your money, I have some good answers, alhamdulillah. If you're rich, anyone, come talk to me. And you don't have to be Egyptian. I don't discriminate. Okay, so our panel right now is going to feature Professor Nader Hashemi, who's the director of the Alwaleed Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and associate professor of the Middle East and Islamic politics at Georgetown University. We also have Abdullah. Yes. So Professor Hashemi, if you can come up, and Professor Abdullah Alaoudh, who is the Countering Authoritarianism Senior Director at the Middle East Center for Democracy. He previously served as a Saudi Director at the Freedom Initiative. So welcome, Dr. Alaoudh. And of course, Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl, who you all know very well. This promises to be a very exciting and important discussion, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. So we are going to start with Nader and then Abdullah. And then I will go. We each will speak for about 20 minutes, and then after we've all gone, I'll give each of us about 5 minutes to comment, whichever in response, if you want to comment in response to anything said, and then we will take questions from the audience, inshallah.
Thank you, Khaled. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. First of all, congratulations to the Usuli Institute, to Grace, Sharif, and your impressive team for bringing us all together. I firmly believe that this is a historic event, hopefully the start of something important and transformative. And one initial thought that I have is that, one of the things that I love about being a Muslim is that it's very much a community experience. Muslims and Islam is not about an individual sitting by themselves in their homes, but it's about coming together. And we come together to pray, to fast. Community engagement is in the DNA of Islam, because one of the pillars of Islam is Hajj, where Muslims from around the world gather together to worship, to observe rituals, but also to get to know each other and to familiarize ourselves with what's happening in the broader world and in the Muslim Ummah. The tragedy of our contemporary moment is that unfortunately Hajj is taking place in the context of a deeply authoritarian regime where coming together among Muslims and being able to have the type of important political conversations that can speak to our contemporary moment are very difficult. And this is one of the key features of authoritarian and tyrannical control. Keep people separate, keep people depoliticized, keep people focusing on their narrow individual concerns and not talking about the collective dilemmas and challenges that we're facing both as a Muslim community and as a world. So that's why I'm so impressed that the Usuli Institute was able to pull this thing together, because as we know, even here in North America, Muslim spaces are often controlled spaces. They're authoritarian spaces. Khaled has written extensively about this in his book on authoritarianism. His little book, he has a lot of stories that resonated deeply with me when I read them, that there are these little dictators in all of our little mosques who try to control the space. And so having an open, free space where we can talk without censorship is something to cherish. So I wanted to begin with that observation. I also want to begin with another preliminary observation, that it's a huge honor to share the stage this morning with Khaled Abou El Fadl and Abdullah Alaoudh, especially in the context of a discussion of political tyranny and authoritarianism, because both of my colleagues here, my fellow Muslim brothers, have been victimized very profoundly by authoritarian tyrannical control. Khaled, in terms of the abuse that he suffered when he was in an Egyptian jail. And I remember when he was talking about that, how that moment transformed him in terms of his moral commitment to work for human rights. And of course, you should know this. If you don't know this, Abdullah Alaouddh's father, Salman Alaoudh, is in jail right now, torn away from his family for simply having the audacity to express a dissident point of view. Thrown in jail, and only Allah knows when he'll get out. Thankfully, among the three of us, I'm the least one who's been victimized by authoritarianism, but I study authoritarianism in terms of my vocation. And so I want to offer a few comments on this that reflect this current moment that we're passing through. So it's not an exaggeration to say that these are the dark days of Muslim history. These are the dark days of Muslim history. I started using that term increasingly after the crushing of the Arab Spring. Repressive and tyrannical regimes have been ascendant in recent years, and civil society groups and movements for democracy have been under severe pressure and in decline in recent years. One bright moment happened this summer. Because we're a Muslim community, I want to acknowledge it. Not a lot of people pay attention to this part of the world, but there was an important breakthrough that I think we should celebrate in Bangladesh, where a longstanding dictator was toppled by a pro-democracy student movement. And one of my students actually was there during the summer. He was sending me photographs. And he was talking about how this was very much a grassroots sort of movement. And one of the symbols that the young Bangladeshi Muslim students were using to fight against political tyranny was the Palestinian flag. The Palestinian flag for Muslims is a symbol fighting against oppression, dictatorship, struggling for a voice, struggling for justice. So that was very encouraging. On the periphery of the Islamic world, Malaysia and Indonesia, there's some bright spots. But the rest of the Islamic world, particularly in the core of the region, in the Arab world, including Iran and Turkey and North Africa, it's a dark, dark picture. And the sad reality of this moment, as we look and observe on these dark days of Muslim history, the prognosis, as far as we can predict, looks even darker. And so it's a depressing time. And I think the point that I want to convey is that this dark days of Muslim history is really embodied by the current genocide in Gaza. In fact, what I want to say, the key point that I want to articulate this morning is that the genocide in Gaza is a measure, a reflection of the dark days of Muslim history. When we have a genocide happening in full view of the world, and it continues. We've passed the first year anniversary, and the Muslim world observes this darkness, and it continues to get darker. And so some people might ask, well, why are you blaming Muslim states, or why are you critical of Muslim regimes when it comes to the war and the genocide in Gaza? We know it's Israel and the West that's doing all of these things. And yes, I think we must acknowledge the objective fact that it's primarily, first and foremost, the leadership of the State of Israel, backed by the West, that bear command and control responsibility for what we've seen in Gaza over the last year. But I want to make the point that it's very easy for us Muslims to blame others for what's happening. I think because this is a Muslim gathering, and because this is a conference rooted in Islamic ethics, we have an obligation to be self-reflective, to be self-critical, and in this spirit, given that this is a gathering, and given that Khaled Abou El Fadl is here, who I have described a long time ago as the leading Muslim ethicist of our time, I want to cast my analytical lens on the Islamic world and offer some comments with respect to this ongoing moral obscenity that's characterized by a genocide in Gaza. And so I want to just remind us all of the moral gravity of this moment. News of Gaza now is not on the top of the headlines, it's still there, but other things have taken over. But just this past week, as I read the news, several things were brought to my attention, and it'll help frame how important and how serious the situation in Gaza is. 2 days ago, the United Nations issued a report, a special commission of inquiry, headed by a very prominent and distinguished international human rights official, Navi Pillay, who used to be the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, they issued a report 2 days ago that said the following, quote, Israel has perpetuated a concerted policy to destroy Gaza's healthcare system as part of a broader assault on Gaza. The report continued and said, Israel is committing war crimes and the crime against humanity of extermination with relentless and deliberate attacks on medical personnel and facilities. So here we stand on the first anniversary of the Gaza genocide, and we have yet another report that uses the term extermination. CNN just this morning, as I'm reading the news, reports no food has entered northern Gaza since the start of October, putting 1 million people at risk of going hungry, according to the World Food Program report. Recent updates tell us that what's happening right now in northern Gaza is there's an attempt to physically depopulate that area, push them all into the south of Gaza. Gaza had the distinction of being one of the most densely populated places in the world. 2 million people living in a small strip of land, roughly 25 miles long, 5 miles wide. Depopulating that northern part gives Gaza sort of another unique distinction. If it was one of the most densely populated parts of the world, now it is for sure. Half of the population children, most of the population refugees. This week, I read a horrific report that came out, testimonials from doctors. I think in this year of tragedy in Gaza, one of the, I think, heroic groups of people who really, I think, deserve full praise are those doctors who volunteered to go to Gaza to treat the victims of genocide. Some of them, I know some of them are my friends. There was a report that came out in the New York Times today that just shocked me. I've heard these reports before, but this is a firsthand testimonial. In this week's New York Times, a war surgeon had the following thing to say. I worked as a trauma surgeon in Gaza from March 25th to April 8th. I volunteered in Ukraine and Haiti, and I grew up in Flint, Michigan. I've seen violence, and I worked in conflict zones. But of the many things that stood out about working in a hospital in Gaza, one got to me. Nearly every day I was there, I saw a new young child who had been shot in the head or the chest, virtually all of whom went on to die, 13 in total. At the time, this is the same doctor narrating the story, at the time I assumed this had been the work of maybe one particular sadistic soldier located nearby, but after returning home, I met an emergency medical physician who had worked in a different hospital in Gaza 2 months before me. And he said, I couldn't believe the number of kids that I saw shot in the head, he told me. To my surprise, he responded, yeah, me too, every single day. And so what we're seeing here, one of the grotesque aspects of this genocide is you have these sadistic soldiers who are targeting young children in the head and in the chest. And these are reports that I've read several times. Children are brought in, they don't have shrapnel wounds, they have head wounds because not one, but many Israeli soldiers are effectively using the children of Gaza as target practice. And so all of these horrors beg the question, speak to the question, where is the Islamic world at this moment of genocide in Gaza? What can we learn over the last year that's transpired? And what does all of this have to do with the question of political authoritarianism and political tyranny? And I think it has a lot to do with political authoritarianism and political tyranny. So observation number one, we know that political tyranny and dictatorship and authoritarianism is a deep and expanding problem because it is deeply connected with the abuse of power, with corruption, with the devastating effects it brings on societies that live under a dictatorship. Innocent people are victimized, resources are wasted, standards of living decline, inequality, mass poverty and pauperization increase. These are all features of most of the Arab and Islamic world. There's zero accountability for these abuses, and it gets worse with every passing day. The key point here is that as we observe the genocide in Gaza, we see another reason why political tyranny is such a problem for our community. Because when there is a major catastrophe, a major calamity, in this case a genocide, these tyrannical Muslim regimes are completely impotent, unable, or unwilling to do anything to stop it. And so we have another reason why political authoritarianism, political tyranny is a problem. And the fundamental fact remains that the problem with these ruling authoritarian political systems and tyrannical regimes is that the rulers that dominate them are first and foremost interested in preserving their political thrones, not in trying to do anything that's ethical in terms of alleviating the plight of their own populations, let alone the plight of populations that are suffering under gross human rights violations. There's zero accountability. So the question then becomes, many Muslims, I think, who perhaps haven't thought through the issue, why? Why hasn't the Muslim world done more? I mean, there's like 50 plus Muslim states. Some of them are very wealthy. A lot of them have resources. What is it about this moment that has created this situation of impotence, inability, as the genocide drags on and on and on and nothing happens? I think one fundamental fact that needs to be pointed out is that Muslim dictators, particularly those in the Arab world, are deeply fearful of the Palestine question, of the suffering of the Palestinians. Why? Because it produces mass mobilization among Muslims. I don't have time to get into this, but the question of the suffering of the Palestinians is a key marker of identity for contemporary Muslims. When there's a genocide, when there's mass suffering, people come into the street. If you're an authoritarian ruler, you don't want people coming in the street. You want to keep them pacified. You want to keep them distracted. And of course, the next question comes when there's mass suffering. Well, why aren't you doing anything about it? Why is the Muslim world? So these questions are deeply fearful. They're uncomfortable questions that authoritarian rulers don't want to have to engage in because they don't want to be held accountable. And that's a fundamental feature of authoritarian control. So that's why the question of Palestine, I think, is such a dangerous theme. And you can see sort of how these dictators in the Muslim world, particularly in the Arab world, have tried to shift their positions, at least publicly claiming that they're doing something for the Palestinians, at least rhetorically, but in effect doing very, very little. So the mass suffering of Palestinians is dangerous for authoritarian control because of these reasons. And you can, I'm following this fairly closely, watching these Arab regimes and Muslim regimes do these careful, choreographed sort of, largely public relation exercise to send a message to their citizens that they care about Palestine, but in effect doing in many ways, not just doing nothing, and I'm going to get to this in a moment, but in fact, objectively speaking, helping Israel out at this moment. That's the sad tragedy. And this is why I say this is one of the dark moments of Muslim history, because it's tough to think of another moment in the history of Islam, either in the Reconquista of Al-Andalus, or in the height of the Crusades, or in the heyday of colonialism, when we've seen this level of moral malfeasance from Muslim leaders. Not just doing nothing to help Muslims who are facing genocide or victimization, but actively helping and perpetuating the perpetrator of a genocide. And I'll get to that in a moment. And this has been understudied. We need someone to sort of look at this. But I think when all is said and done, one day when we get access to the records and to the archives, I will not be surprised if it is revealed that many of these Muslim regimes were deeply, deeply, deeply connected and associated with this genocidal campaign, helping Israel perpetuate the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide that we know right now. So one point I want to mention as an observation that's worth noting in the context of the relationship between political tyranny and the genocide in Gaza. It's widely known that the Middle East, particularly Arab countries, oil-producing Arab countries in the East, are the biggest purchaser of arms in the world. The biggest weapon systems. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. Now ask yourself, given this abundance of weapons that are in the hands of Muslim countries, has one bullet gone to defend the people of Gaza? One bullet. The answer is self-evident. In fact, it gets worse the more you analyze what's going on. Recall back in April when there was a conflict between Israel and Iran fired a series of missiles toward Israel after its embassy was attacked in Damascus. How did these Arab dictators respond? They mobilized their militaries, they mobilized their intelligence services to protect Israel from the incoming Iranian missiles. Not to protect the people of Gaza, but they mobilized to protect Israel, and they got a lot of credit for that. If you saw sort of what was saying in sort of the political circles in Washington, D.C. that I follow, they were all supportive. This is why we support these moderate Arab regimes, because they're doing what they're supposed to do, protect our interests in the region, not protecting the interests of the people in the region. And the situation gets worse the more you analyze what's going on. I'm following what's happening in the region in the context of the student protest movement that happened in this country, one of the bright spots over the last year. In Abu Dhabi, at the NYU campus in Abu Dhabi, there was a graduation ceremony. And one student had the audacity in the middle of the graduation ceremony to stand up and say, "Free Palestine." The next day, she was deported. This is in the heart of the Muslim world. Free Palestine? In the heart of the Muslim world, and you get deported? And if someone asks me why that happened, I'll explain it. I'm going over my time here, but these are just facts. In Jordan, we have reports. You attend a rally in defense of the Palestinians trying to stop a genocide. You wear the traditional kafiyeh scarf. You can get stopped and arrested. This has been documented. Abdullah Alaoudh is on this stage. I won't talk about the crackdown of online solidarity for Palestinians happening among Saudis, but there's a similar story there, and another similar story in Egypt and Morocco. A criminalization of standing up for genocide in the Muslim world by simply putting on a scarf. That's how bad things are. And I'm just scratching the surface here. I read another report in the same context. When Houthis started to attack the shipping lanes in the Red Sea, Arab states came to the rescue, not of the Palestinians, but of Israel. A report in the Times of Israel noted a few months ago that the disruption of the maritime shipping lanes in the Red Sea allowed Arab states to shift and create a new land corridor through Saudi Arabia, through Jordan, and then into Israel to make sure that the Israeli economy was not hurt by the attack on the ships that the Houthis were doing, according to them, to stop a genocide in Gaza. Another example of the level of moral malfeasance that characterizes ruling tyrants in the Islamic world. I read another report. I don't know if it's true. It needs to be investigated, but I have every reason to believe in the early days of the genocide in Gaza, Jordan allows itself to be a conduit for a land transfer of weapons from the United States to Israel over Jordan to be dropped on the people of Gaza. How many of these Arab states that have diplomatic ties with Israel have had the moral decency to cut off diplomatic relations in the context of genocide? How many? Zero. Another reflection of how dark things are. And then it's also important to just remember where we were on October the 6th, the day before the attack that happened last year. On October the 6th, the general view in the West, in all the capitals of the West, and in all the capitals of the Arab world, was that we were on the verge, allegedly, of a major breakthrough. We were on the verge of a major transformation that would allegedly bring peace and prosperity to the Middle East, because Saudi Arabia and Israel were supposed to establish normalized relations with support from the United States in the context of what's called the Abraham Accords. And of course, one of the key features of the Abraham Accords was that the Palestinians get absolutely nothing out of it. The Abraham Accords were a moment when all of the Arab states, abandoning a position that they had adopted earlier in the late 20th century, where they said no relations with Israel unless the Palestinians get a state or get some justice, had now, by this time, on October the 6th, roughly a year ago, all were eager, competing with each other to jump into bed with Netanyahu at the encouragement of the United States. And that's just a reminder of how bad things were. Of course, the assumption was, from the perspective of all these capitals in the Arab world, Islamic world, and in the West, that the Palestine question was over. The Palestinians had lost. One by one Arab and Muslim country was capitulating, willing to jump into bed with Netanyahu and establish relations, assuming that the question of Palestine was lost and it didn't matter anymore. It didn't matter for the dictators of the region, who are accountable to their international backers, but it certainly mattered to the average citizen in the Arab and Islamic world, where the question of Palestine, as I said, is a key marker of identity and will not go away anytime soon. So this is where we are. And so this is the dark picture. There have been some bright moments, and I want to mention one bright moment, and that is the role that South Africa has played in the context of this genocide. I was at a conference in Doha recently with the South African foreign minister who led the campaign at the International Court of Justice, Naledi Pandor, who actually happens to be Muslim. And I had a chance to meet with her. And anytime at the conference her name was mentioned, or South Africa's name were mentioned, round of applause. People were just in awe of what South Africa had done for the Palestinians. And the question becomes, in the context of this panel, the relationship between political tyranny, authoritarianism, and Gaza, why didn't any Arab or Muslim state take South Africa to the International Court of Justice for violating the UN Convention? They had the resources. They could have made a case. The answer is simple why they didn't do it. Because at the heart of South Africa's application at the International Court of Justice, charging Israel with violating the UN Genocide Convention, is the principle of accountability for human rights abuses. This is something that dictatorships disdain. They don't want to be held accountable for what they're doing, especially when it comes to human rights violations. And so what South Africa was doing and representing was an anathema, was a horror story for ruling dictators in our part of the world. That's why they didn't do it. And in fact, if anything, I'm willing to bet that when the Secretary of State Blinken goes to these various Arab capitals in the context of this crisis in Gaza and meets with these dictators, publicly these dictators utter words of support for Palestinians, but privately they tell Blinken, why is Israel taking so long to finish the job? This is causing problems we want this issue over with. This is the level of moral perfidy, malfeasance, and disgust that characterizes the contemporary Muslim moment. The sympathy and support, for what Israel is doing to Hamas, to Hezbollah, and to the region is very much supported by these dictators because their vision of the future is very much in the context of the Abraham Accords. The future of the region will be shaped by the United States and these ruling elites, not by the people of the region, and certainly not by the Palestinians. So this is the objective sort of reality. One other positive thing I want to say before I wrap up, because I realize I'm going off time. One of the positive developments that's happened, and I've just noticed this, and I've heard anecdotal evidence, but it's something to sort of think about and to build upon, is the nonviolent Muslim boycott movement in solidarity with Gaza. I've heard from my students, from my friends across the Islamic world, that Muslims voluntarily, not really because they've been organized, there's been a little bit of social media sort of promotion of this, have boycotted Starbucks, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and other American companies that are deeply invested in Israel. And this has had huge economic setbacks for these companies. And this is sort of a movement that's coming from the grassroots. We can't get our governments to maybe change policies, but at least with our own money, we can boycott these organizations and companies and corporations that are indirectly involved in the genocide in Gaza. Imagine for a moment if these Muslims who were part of this boycott movement really had a voice in their countries. Imagine for a moment if they had representation in their countries, that sentiment could be translated in terms of political power and decision-making. What a different world we would be living in. And the last point that I want to make is a response to this argument that you sometimes hear about Muslims. Well, what can the Muslim world do? We don't have the power. We don't have any influence. We can't sort of shape the outcome of this genocide. Well, let me just remind you of a story that's important, and it's worth remembering. And the context is that with every passing decade, the level of moral decadence of Muslim leaders has gotten worse. But if you go back to the 1970s, there was one particular leader that I do respect, and he actually did do something to try and change the global equation over the question of Palestine. And of course, I'm thinking about the late King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. Recall in 1973, there was an Arab-Israeli war. And in response to that war, King Faisal, to his credit, organized an oil boycott of OPEC against the West. Prices of oil went up. Western leaders were shocked. The equation is changing. Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State of the United States at the time, really disgusting person, a certifiable war criminal, travels to Saudi Arabia and meets with King Faisal. And in a transcript that's been released, the conversation goes something like this. Henry Kissinger asks King Faisal, "What the hell are you doing?" He tries to appeal to his own self-interest. And Kissinger tells King Faisal, "This is bad for your economy. You can't sell your oil, you won't be able to develop. This makes no sense, King Faisal. Why don't you reconsider?" And King Faisal, to his credit, looks back at Henry Kissinger and says, "We are a simple people. We come from the desert. We were raised on goat milk and dates. And if need be, we will return to that life, but we will not abandon our Palestinian brothers and sisters. Henry Kissinger was he's never heard a Muslim leader talk like that. And so King Faisal was assassinated 2 years later, but I'm saying that example of a Muslim leader who's willing to look a US Secretary of State in the eye and saying, we will take a hit financially, but we're not going to abandon Muslims who are facing genocide. This is the type of leadership, ideally in a democratic context, that we yearn for and we have to struggle for. And that is something that hopefully we one day, inshallah, can accomplish. So in conclusion, in the context of what's happening today in Gaza, I just want to remind everyone that, this genocide, unfortunately, is not going to end anytime soon. A good friend of mine who's a close observer of this topic noted that we could still be at the beginning of this story rather than at the end. In other words, the worst is yet to come. There's no reason to think this is going to change. Netanyahu, backed by the United States, backed by both political parties in this country, knows he can get away with whatever he wants, and there's no one in the Arab or Islamic world who's going to stand up to him. So there's no reason to think this genocide is going to end anytime soon. That's where we are. So we have to be prepared for that. The key question, I think, that all of us have a moral obligation to think about, especially at a conference like this at the Usuli Institute, is what is our ethical moral responsibility as Muslims in the age of genocide? What is our moral and ethical responsibility? Since most people here are Americans, what is our responsibility as American Muslims at this moment? I think that's the big question that should be the focus of our conversations, that should be the subject of Jummah khutbah. Unfortunately, they're not. But this is what our Islamic ethics demands of us at this critical moment in time. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader. We'll now go to Abdullah Alaoudh.
Shukran, Sheikh. Thank you so much, Nader. First of all, congratulations on this great conference, and I'm happy to be a very small part of this. And to the question of the panel, the discussion that Nader just presented, it reminded me of a saying that I once heard from my father. He said, ذهب المستعمرون الحمر وبقي المستعمرون السمر. And he quoted some of the historians. It's not something that he came up with, but he said something along the line of the red colonizers left, but the brown colonizers remained in our world, and that's exactly what happened. And that's, I think, exactly an analogy that I can present to show the relationship between tyranny and colonization. And if you wonder why this relationship is essential to both of them, is because of this relationship. I remember, for example, when the Arab Spring erupted, one of the thinkers from the Gulf, Dr. Mohammed Al-Ahmari, once said, he said, this is perhaps the beginning of the second independence. And second independence meaning, like the first, of course, if some of you remember, read history, like the first independence, and Sheikh mentioned that yesterday, is when we started in the Arab world and Muslim world generally to get rid of the colonization and their, equipment, their thinking, their institutions, their mentality, and then, but what we realized is that they are deeper than what we thought, and it was preceded by what Malik bin Nabi once said, al-qabiliyya lil-istimar, the ability to be colonized. And then after they left, what remained is these elements in our societies that actually made colonization only physically not present, but rather intellectually, institutionally, mentally intact at large. And that's why you have dictators in the Arab world and Muslim worlds, and the dictators generally, that's why a lot of times they call them client states, and it's in such a shape that the very existence of tyranny in these states is directly linked to these, believe it or not, these countries around the world that actually take pride in being democracies. And it is the irony of how values are not applied to our part of the world. And one of the things that I also want to mention is why dictatorships refused any popular pressure or any popular existence. Why these dictatorships see the threat from what they call the threat from within, which is their own people, more existential than, for example, any foreign threat. The idea that, for example, the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Jordan or some other countries fear that a revolution from within or even a small protest here and there is more threatening to their idea of the system that they have than, for example, Israel, let's say. It is part of their own idea of ground of legitimacy. And I'll be less theoretical here by giving this example. When Khaled bin Salman, the defense minister, Saudi defense minister, came to Washington prior to the October 7th, he was talking to decision makers, journalists, and one of the journalists actually was present during, a dinner in which Khaled bin Salman was talking about the relationship and the prospect of relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And he exactly said, and I quote, if Hamas is seeking help and protection, and that's his own idea of things, from Iran, why didn't we do that and seek protection and help from not the United States? I mean, it's usually the United States, which is still questionable. But I mean, the idea of seeking help. But I mean, he's not even seeking help from the United States. He said from Israel. So this is a new idea in the region that they're thinking they're not just client states to the United States, but rather now to Israel, and they are happy with it. So they'll go to prison you, to torture you, and go after you in order to have this relationship with Israel, because they see Israel as the guardian, as as a state that proves itself to be equipped with the highest technological advancements that can not just protect itself, but also some other neighboring countries. So why I mention this story and this context, because I want to tell you what October 7th did to this idea of Israel protecting other countries. So right after what happened in October 7th, so people like Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, who were trying to rush to Israel to protect them and to give them equipments and arms sales and to be basically to present themselves as protectorate for these for Israel, they realized that Israel was not able to protect itself from such an attack, and that basically threatened the idea that Israel is strong enough to do this and that and to protect itself and to even go beyond its own borders to protect other countries. And if you see what Israel is doing right now, yes, maybe it's insane from a point of view, and it is insane, it's inhumane, but they do not read this from the humanistic part of things, but rather from what they call realpolitik. They see things as numbers, they see people as numbers, they see things as calculations. So for them to, what they call regain or reestablish the deterrence factor in the region, they will do everything to regain that, and that will be at the expense of your family, my family, your child, my child, everyone, men, women, civilians, everyone in the region. They started in Gaza, they went to Lebanon, and they can go anywhere else, as Nader mentioned. Because their idea is to prove to themselves, to their own, to their own institutions, and to the other Arab countries, that they can protect themselves and can present themselves as a strong country, and therefore they will do everything to reach that point. And that's their way of trying to go back to the talk about like normalization and basically to avoid the all these points about like Palestinian state, Palestinian cause, Palestinian identity, all of these things. And in return, what the Arab countries are doing is now responding to all of these things instead of just, being horrified about the casualties, about the people, about the killed, about the victims. They're applauding what they call the strength of these operations. And the quick example that I was talking just yesterday, like in the Pagers operation, I mean, the normal human being response will be, oh my God, what a horrifying experience, like these casualties, these victims. But to Arab dictators, now I'm not talking about Israelis or like Zionists, I'm talking about Arab dictators. They said, oh my God, wow, they have such a capability, they can do such an operation, they are so smart, they have been working on this for a long time, they can do this, they have such a, an equipment and idea and advancement, and they can do this, they can help us with such things, and instead of sending a tiger squad to the consulate to kill and dismember a guy in such a stupid way, we can use a more advanced technology to go after our own, critics and dissidents and people. That's their own way of thinking. It's not rather how to reconcile with our own people and respond to their own demands and be part of, the values in society and work for the cause that everybody believes in. And that's how Mohammed bin Salman was actually negotiating with the Israelis and the Americans. When he said, for example, 98% of his own people, of the Saudis, are against normalization, are siding with the Palestinians in their own cause. And he knew that, and he told them, he said, well, if I do this deal with you, I'm going to be assassinated. So I'd rather have what it takes to go, for such a deal, and I should have the cost that I'm willing to, pay, but you have also to pay your share by giving me protection, and protection is not to the Saudi state. I should be corrected, but rather to his own throne, and not to the Saudi people, but to his own throne. So that's their own way of thinking. Because of lack of legitimacy, they never came because they are elected or on a consensus or any society, any social contract, or a more communal consensus, but rather it's because they did it by force, and they think there are other people who can give them better force and can make their force more advanced. And they see, for example, Israel as, an example for such, Athiri. I don't want to go along with all of this, but I'll end as Nader with at least a positive note. That yes, you see all of this, and there are a lot of discussions all the time about like, okay, we talk about this all the time, and what do we do? I mean, and there's nothing to change, and I'm just an individual, and like even within Saudi Arabia, it's like you cannot even talk about Palestine. You get arrested, you get tortured. Like my cousin got arrested over this. He was talking about, he was tweeting against the normalization with Israel, and he was arrested for it, and he's still in jail. His name is Abdul Aziz. Check him out. So there are people who would say, yeah, what do we do? I mean, are we able to make a change at all toward this Palestinian cause and to stop the normalization at the expense of our own people and rights and basic liberty? And I will give this example, like our friend who is and proudly part of our political party, NAS, the National Assembly Party. She started this campaign like a year and a half ago, not last Hajj, but the Hajj before, when we heard about a khutbah in Arafah, that the speaker in khutbah in Arafah was preparing a line to pave the way for the normalization, talking about the relationship with Israel. We got a copy of that khutbah before he even announced it, before he even said it on TV. So we started this campaign. She started this campaign. We started this hashtag on Twitter. So if people said, okay, social media, how is going to change anything? Well, here is the story. So we started this campaign. The hashtag in a few hours was trending in Saudi Arabia. Everybody was talking about it. There was a huge backlash from within. Of course, all like anonymous accounts, people without their official names or real names. And it actually left a huge impact within our society, to the degree that actually the khatib or the speaker deleted that line a few hours, and when he gave the speech during Arafah, that line was not there. He deleted the line about normalization because of the backlash, because of the pressure. So just imagine, he was instructed by the state to mention this normalization because they wanted religious authorization and stamp on this normalization. And because of the pressure, because of the campaign, this changed. So this is just an example of such a closed society where public sphere is completely shut down, and we made such a small change, I think, but it can help in the long term, making an impact toward helping our Palestinians and our Palestinian brothers and sisters. I want to stop here and just give it to the Sheikh.
Thank you, Abdullah. Well, already Nader and Abdullah covered so much ground, and it's difficult, very difficult to follow these two. The relationship between authoritarianism, dictatorship, and genocide is like the relationship between disease and dirt and filth. Between dictatorship and genocide is very much like disease and filth. And incidentally, make sure that you get a copy of the Palestine sermons, because this actually has to do with what I'm going to talk about in a second. I remember during the Arab Spring, or what was commonly called the Arab Spring, one of the intense debates, and anyone from Egypt will remember this, talking about my favorite people. So in Egypt, of course, there was an elections going on in which there were representatives from the Muslim Brotherhood and the army, the military, sort of put on their man to run in the elections, Shafiq. And there were ad nauseum arguments and debates going on in Egypt. What was of particular significance to me and what I was interested in the most was following Israeli media at the time, because you really want to know what you should do, what path you should take, see what your enemy is saying. See that who doesn't like you, who doesn't want what is good for you is saying. And what remained with me, and what I would hear repeatedly in Israeli media at the time, was the intense anxiety about any form of democratic order in the Muslim world, among the neighbors. Now, mind you, so for instance, Israelis would like the Ayatollah regime to go away in Iran, but that's because the Israelis are convinced, and they've been working on Iran for a long time, trying to convince the Iranian people that Israel is a friend, because they anticipate that if there were free elections in Iran, that the Iranians today would elect a government friendly to Israel. So they don't mind that. But with that exception, there's intense anxiety about the emergence of any type of democratic, strong civil societies in neighboring countries to Israel. And as the Egyptians were going on endlessly about Muslim Brotherhood or no Muslim Brotherhood and so on, you heard Israeli media constantly repeat that trope that, well, if you give freedom to Muslim people, then Muslim people are going to elect Islamists, and if Islamists are elected, they will seek our extermination, etc., etc. And you can see the future and the relationship between authoritarianism and genocide in the fact that the country that was extremely active in Washington to convince the Obama administration at the time, and it was especially through the then Secretary of State, to convince Washington to oppose the settling or the enduring or the permanence of any type of democratic order in the Muslim world was Israel. Israel played a critical role in lobbying the Obama administration, working through the then Kelly's, what was his name, the Secretary of State at the time, and they were focused on Egypt and then after Egypt, Tunisia, but it was constantly the same theme, that people listened to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates when because Saudi Arabia and Emirates were constantly expressing extreme and maximum anxiety about any type of democratic regime anywhere, whether it was Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, but the sort of reliance on Israel that both Nader and Abdullah talked about, well, it's not just reliance on Israeli technology, but reliance on Israeli lobbying in Washington, D.C. And Israelis were very much actively lobbying, even after the Egyptian elections, for the United States, while officially condemning the military coup in Egypt, but indeed to support it and to restore aid to Egypt and not to punish the Egyptian military for overthrowing the civilian government there. And in fact, Sisi himself emerged as America's man and as Israel's man, as Saudi Arabia's man and the Emirati man, because of his stellar record as an authoritarian and sort of a psychotic psychotic individual within the Egyptian army. So, I mean, it's quite remarkable. Now, the reason I mentioned the Palestine sermons is that years ago, I was predicting that exactly what we saw in Gaza, what we're seeing in Gaza is going to happen. And it's not because I'm a fortune teller, but because all you have to do is read the equations. Israel has been repeatedly, every year or 2 years, waging an onslaught against Gaza. Israel has been telling the Palestinians in the entire post-9/11 period, you must accept that you've been defeated, and you must come to us. And I've heard this in Israeli media a gazillion times. And I'm going to come to this, but one of the problems that we have is that, again, consciousness and awareness. Remember I said yesterday, the first problem and the primary problem is a problem of awareness. And if you are not aware of what the side that hates you the most is saying about you, if you are not aware of, if you don't know what that side is saying, then your awareness is severely crippled. And so what that side was saying repeatedly, again and again, it is time, and especially after Israel annexed Jerusalem, and especially after they did what they thought, if you follow back when the Trump administration moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, and Israel watched the reaction of the Muslim world after the embassy was moved to Jerusalem. And all the fears of the American administration before, all the American politicians, part of their sort of the accepted dogma was, we can't move the embassy because this will cause an uproar in the Muslim world. Israel has been telling the American administration, don't worry about the Muslim world. Yeah. They have no uproar. I mean, they're insignificant. They don't count. Ignore them. And when Trump moved the embassy and Israel turned out to be exactly right about the irrelevance of the Arab Muslim masses, the point that was being conveyed, what we have been telling you, that all these masses, all these Egyptians, over 100 million, all these Syrian factions, all the Saudi masses, all are entirely irrelevant. All we have to do is continue our practice from the age of colonialism of client leaders. We appoint figureheads who deliver whatever we want from civil society by vacating and voiding civil society. In other words, we don't need to worry about the 100 million Egyptians. We have to just worry about one person. The person is Sisi. And that's extremely convenient if you want, and this takes me to the issue of the whole notion of susceptibility to becoming colonized. Because this is where I want to emphasize. This idea of how can you have a people that indeed are susceptible to being colonized, as opposed to a people who are very difficult to colonize. Well, although, mind you, I am afraid of rednecks. I don't know if you guys are, but and
Egyptians.
Egyptians to make my stomach churn. It's a different
Just
matter.
there's the rich ones, right?
Yeah, well, Allah yarham. Okay, now, and you know, when I lived in Texas, we have a lot of people from Texas here. You know, when you have a neighbor that puts out the American flag, it's sort of weird that we live in a country where if you have a neighbor that hangs the American flag, you're actually scared of them. It's very strange. I have thought as a mental exercise to overcome my own indoctrination by authoritarianism is to hang out the American flag, give the confused people, like a redneck who's an Arab, but anyway, and a Muslim. But what is the thing about so-called rednecks? Their love affair with their weapons, their sense of rebelliousness against authority, their insistence that their property is their property and no one can come on their property because they are the kings of property. Well, of course, the problem is the racism part. But if you put the racism part aside, you actually have a psychology that cannot be colonized. That sense of pride, sense of self that is proud of owning the land and controlling its own destiny. If you take the racism out, now take the other side, the flip of. Yesterday I mentioned the Egyptians who were working with Allenby's forces, cleaning their poop and so on. But you even take in our modern moment, and this picture, think of some basic things. Take one thing I mentioned in a khutbah recently, and we've been chatting about this. When something like the guardians of the two holy sites, after a crime by all measures, the perishing of hundreds of pilgrims from heat stroke and thirst. I have the testimonials of people who were there and who told me that the authorities in Saudi Arabia knew that people were dying for hours and refused to give them medical aid. And yet, when that government turns around and says, do you know who's to blame for this massacre of the Hajj, of the pilgrims? It is Abdullah Alaoudh, this fellow here. The Saudi government exactly did that. And we Muslims have now become in such a relationship to words and ideas where automatically it is understood amongst us that we don't take words very seriously. So if the Saudi government says, well, Abdullah Alaoudh is to blame for killing the pilgrims, we all sort of shrug our shoulders. We all know that you don't take the words too seriously. You don't take things too seriously. We don't take our relationship to words is a grossly disassociated relationship, a relationship marked by disassociation. Let me introduce one other idea in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi wrote a very famous text about despotism. And al-Kawakibi purpose in writing this book was to argue that despotism is a corruption of the religion, that despotism corrupts the theology of people. And among the things he says in his book, of course, he said it in typical classical language. So, but anyway, that despotism teaches people to obsess over minutia and teaches people to be afraid of each other. Now, someone yesterday was mentioning, or maybe it was this morning, I don't know, time, that when in the midst of this genocide, I was listening to in the car, it was my brother or something, and you find in the midst of this genocide, someone talk about the genocide, and then what he finds people, fellow Muslims, obsessing about is whether he is playing music in the background or not. Yeah. Or someone, again, we were talking yesterday, and someone was telling me, oh, you know, the problem was that a lot of Muslims have with me is that I'm too liberal, or that's the accusation. So Shi'i, Mu'tazili, liberal. The fear of ideas in itself, the fear of the future, the desire to control not just your own destiny, and the distrust of fate and the distrust of Allah, of God, but also the control the destiny of your own children. Where do you think all of this comes from? It is from the psychology of despotism. The fact, listen, let's be very frank. The fact that when you have to work with your fellow Muslims, immediately, if I'm going to work with my fellow Muslims, I get a gulp in my throat, because immediately I'm looking forward to the arguments, and I'm looking forward to the clash of egos, and I'm looking forward to pettiness and smallness, and I'm looking forward to marginality and stupidity. Like, okay, so we're gonna sit there, and we're supposed to meet and talk about, accomplish something, and the time will be entirely wasted talking about whether women should cover their hair or not, or whether, you know, something completely marginal to everything. Where these are all hand-in-hand characteristics of despotic cultures. Despotic cultures teach anxiety. Despotic cultures teach minuteness and smallness of mind. Despotic cultures teach cowardliness. So, do you know that I was talking about being a professor, and can't tell you, I've had supervised so many dissertations. Do you know that one of the things I hate about advising Muslim students in particular, and again, I don't blame them unless they're Egyptian, but is that when it comes to Muslim students, their anxiety about employment and the job. I've had a lot of Jewish students and I've had a lot of Christian students. And the type of obsessive anxiety about how I'm going to earn a living, I actually don't ever remember having a conversation with a Jewish student or a Christian student about how they're going to make a living. Now, where does this come from? It's from how you're brought up within your family. Whether you trust your safety, whether you feel safe in the world or not. Whether you feel safe in the world or not. Because if you don't feel safe in the world, you are going to pass that anxiety and that fear to your children. I'll give you one last point. Something, and I mentioned this in a khutbah, but we have a journal of Islamic law at UCLA Law. This past year, a couple of Zionist, right-wing Zionist students did something that I can never imagine a Muslim student doing to a Jewish law journal. This is an Islamic law journal that I established back in '98 when I first joined UCLA. The point of the journal is to publish articles, scholarship on Islamic law. And it is the only law review type journal on Islamic law in the United States. Well, this past year, a right-wing Zionist, there were several of them, but one in particular, it's a long story, but basically did something where he became the editor-in-chief of the Islamic Law Journal. But you know what? The way he did it was so daring, so shameless, so entitled, so brilliant, so brave, that while I had to go to the dean to try to remove him, and I did remove him eventually, and I worked very hard to remove him because I didn't want the journal to be taken over by this type of political agenda. And it is the journal that I established. I'm the faculty advisor to the journal. But all along, as much as I was saying very harsh things to the dean about them, to the deans, I respected him. I greatly respected him. And you know why I respected him? Because it is the type of thing that none of us would dare do to the other side. Where does this come from? So because the answer is, well, what do we do about authoritarianism? And think about how you raise your children. Think about how you restructure your own psychology. Think of your relationship to power. And this is why I'm saying the first step is to know that you individually as a person make a difference. And you want a little minute exercise to know how you make a difference. When you know that someone published a book that says the right thing, freaking support it. Only Muslims, wallahi al-azim, only Muslims. You tell them a long speech about the right things, and then you say, here's a book about Palestine. And they'll walk by. You'll have a handful of people that will buy it, and otherwise everyone will just walk by. Ian Pappy just came out with a book, an amazing book about the Zionist lobby. If Muslims wanted to defeat authoritarianism, they would immediately go out and support their cause by spending money and buying the freaking book to send the message that if you are a scholar, Pappy is in England, and you in fact take the right position, we will reward you by saying We will become consumers of your product.
Right.
But if you're sitting there and you're spending your money on coffee, but you won't spend the money, buy the book and throw it away. I don't care. Buy the book and give it to someone on the bus. Buy the book and go to a public library and give it to them. Buy a stack of books, but fight authoritarianism by taking control of your life. Okay, after that, another 5 minutes and then...
Okay, 5 minutes, yeah. Look, there's a lot of things that both of you have said that I wanted to respond to. One of the things you reminded me of, Khaled, as I was listing the way that authoritarian regimes are complicit in the Gaza genocide, I forgot the most obvious one that's staring us in the face, but most people don't recognize, especially Muslims. That this brutal siege on Gaza, that's often described as an Israeli siege, is in reality an Israeli and Egyptian siege. Egypt controls that border. Egypt could do a lot.
Yeah.
And why doesn't it do anything to stop a genocide? Because there is a US-backed, European Union-backed dictatorship in Cairo whose job it is to make sure that Sisi plays by the rules of the game. So here we have another example of sort of how Muslim political tyranny is hurting us, and especially the Palestinians. The other point you mentioned, Khaled, about when you were recalling the Arab Spring and the fear of elections in Egypt and the reportage in Israel, it's not an accident that all of these countries in the Arab world that have diplomatic relations with Israel, the one common feature that defines them is their authoritarian regimes. You can't have a democracy anywhere in the Islamic world establishing diplomatic relations with Israel for the obvious reason. Because if people have a voice, they're going to say, what about the Palestinians? We're not going to establish relations with Israel and recognize the existence of the state of Israel if the Palestinians continue to get nothing. So authoritarianism is now inbuilt into the political landscape of the Middle East, backed by the United States. And so what we're seeing right now, if you're following the foreign policy machinations, as I am, in the region, coming from the United States and the European Union, there was always this view that, look, we can't have democracy in the Arab and Islamic world because it's too chaotic. It produces instability. Look what happened in the context of the Arab Spring. We don't like authoritarian regimes, but maybe that's the only option in town, so we have to support authoritarian regimes. Now there's a new argument that is much more powerful and much more persuasive. We have to support authoritarian regimes, not because they are alleged preservers of stability, but because they're good for Israel. That if there's a change in the equation, if there's democratic elections in Egypt one day, or Jordan, or Morocco, what's going to happen to the Abraham Accords? So we see this sort of connection and convergence between Israeli state interests and the interests of the ruling elites in the Arab world and the United States. And if you follow what's happening right now in the context of the debate on Gaza, there's a lot of discussion about the day after in Gaza. Who's going to control it? The Israelis have a plan. The Americans have a plan, which is basically to extend the dictatorship of Mahmoud Abbas into the Gaza Strip and call that sort of a step forward. Everyone has a plan except the Palestinians. The Palestinian sort of voice in this equation about their own future is just considered to be not important. And this reminds us that this moment is very much, it reminds me of how, even though we're about 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, 100 years since the carve-up of the Middle East after World War I, we're back in many ways where we started. It's a colonial moment again. If you read right now what's being discussed in Washington, D.C., there is huge excitement in the White House and in the State Department over what Israel is doing to Lebanon. You read the reports, they're saying this is a history-defining moment, that Israel now can redraw the map of the Middle East, redraw the balance of power, where Israel will be ascendant, the axis of resistance will be weakened, and Arab dictatorships will benefit from this new equation. I'm using the term history-defining moment. There was a major article recently in Politico where they were quoting from, the internal discussions in the State Department. There is just, forget the human rights violations, the 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs, the devastation, the genocide in Gaza. There is a huge elation that, we can re-establish some sort of, they're not calling it colonial control, but effectively it is. It's decisions being made in Western capitals, backed by Israel and Arab dictators that are running this show, and the masses are left without a voice. And so that just sort of reminds us of how dark this moment is and where things are headed. We have to sort of, I think, be aware of it. I just want to end on this really important point that you talked about, Khaled, about the legacy and the psychology of despotism and how it corrupts our interaction. It corrupts how we think about, the vocations that we choose, how we choose to sort of respond to the world that we live in. These are some of the many, negative effects of despotism that seep into our thinking. And the challenge is, and this is maybe a question for you and for Abdullah, is how do we fight it best? How do we resist this type of sort of, way of thinking, pattern of sort of fear? What's the best way of sort of resisting these negative consequences that flow from decades upon decades upon decades of authoritarian despotic control? Even Muslims who are living here in North America, even the next generation who are removed from what their parents experienced, you see them in many ways reproducing some of these patterns of thinking and thought. And so, this is something that we have to, I think about at a deeper level. And I pose that as a question to you and Abdullah to answer now or any time during this conference.
Abdullah?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer that, but I just have a thought in mind responding to the idea of the depoliticization that Nader also mentioned, Sheikh also talked about. And I think it was Majid Ursana Kailani who once wrote a book, talking about Palestine. هكذا عاد جيل صلاح الدين وهكذا عادت القدس. Right? So he was talking about, I don't know if that book was translated, but the idea is like, he was talking about the generation that actually made Salah ad-Din possible, the generation that made return in Jerusalem to the Muslims possible. And he said something along the line of, this was never, like by the Muslim, like we Muslims sometimes like oversimplify stuff. So we always look for a hero to do things for us, somebody that we put everything on their shoulders and just get things off our shoulders. We didn't think that we have an individualistic responsibility over doing things. And then, like in the Quran, a lot of times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ذَرْنِي وَمَنْ خَلَقْتُ وَحِيدًا, like we created them individually alone, like by themselves. And when he speaks about the same individual, وَكُلُّهُمْ آتِيهِ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ فَرْدًا, and they will return to us alone individually. So they will be responsible individually about what they individually did and thought and contributed to. So we always think about like, oh yeah, that's responsibility of that group or this person, and I'm just going to tell them to do stuff. And we get that all the time. It's like, what do you do to do these things? It's like, what's our own responsibility? What's my responsibility? Anyway, so I was thinking about this and the idea that the Jil Salah ad-Din, the generation that actually made Salah ad-Din possible, was actually a long-term project. It's a venture that started way, way before even Salah ad-Din was born. And this is the response also to the thought that Sheikh mentioned, which is the susceptibility to colonization. That the idea also was made possible way before this. It's a way of thinking that took generations and a generation to develop, and it's a deterioration that started long time ago. And I remember when historians once said that the Asr al-Khashabi في Islam, what they call the Asr al-Khashabi or Takhashub for Islam, it started long time ago. They said even some of them were like really extreme, like went deep in history and said, well, during the Tatar, when the Tatar were coming as invaders to many Muslims' lands. And then fuqaha and jurists, who were supposed to be the elite of the town, were discussing the ruling or the question whether if a woman grows a beard, whether the rules to shaven men's beard applies to the shaven woman's beard. And the invaders were coming to town in a few days. They were just in their way heading to town to slaughter them. And a lot of the historians said, well, it's like they must have seen it coming. It's like they submitted themselves by just talking about trivial questions and rulings and ignoring the vastness of the situation. And so I just want to end with this idea that the resistance of colonization means resistance of colonizers, resistance of this colonizing minds and mentality, including these tyrants who made all of this possible and who were part of this colonizing mentality and colonizing thought in our society. So we have a huge responsibility on each one of us to be part of this movement.
Thank you, Abdullah. I'm eager to get to your questions. I'll make it very brief, but in response to Nader and adding to what Abdullah said, how do we start the process of overcoming?
Right.
And there are several things that. Okay, first is at the individual level. I know that this is hard, but we all owe it to ourselves to concede that we were raised in authoritarian cultures, and not just authoritarian, but defeated cultures. And by the way, it is not true that this means that Islamic cultures have always been authoritarian. Authoritarianism is a historically relevant concept. The powers of the state it cannot be compared, and the understanding of civil society, the way we understand civil society today, is absolutely, completely different than the way we understand civil society just a few hundred years ago. So I'm saying this because some people say, well, we don't want to concede. Isn't it Islamophobic to concede that all Islamic cultures are authoritarian? No, that's not what you're conceding. What you're conceding is that you, having been raised by immigrant parents who grew up in authoritarian colonized cultures, authoritarian and despotic values, including fear of the unknown, the sense of anxiety, instability. I can't tell you how many young people write me and say, my problem is that I want to go the Palestinian protests, or I have been going to Palestinian protests, but my parents are very upset with me, and they're, and they've prohibited me from going. Do I have to obey my parents? So your first obligation is to ask yourself, to what extent do I have that authority? And if you need to read about how you take ownership of the self and empower the self so it is not feeble and little before power. Second is that I don't, to be honest, if you're my age, I don't really care what you do with yourself. I mean, we just wait till it's going, you know, here, death is going to come very soon, and just wait for it, and alhamdulillah. But what I care about is what you've done to your children. Empower your children to think about that question. To what extent have my anxieties, my vulnerabilities, my lack of safety has affected my understanding of authoritarianism and despotism and impacted you, my child? And affirmatively work. I know it's scary because I get scared. If my son comes and says, even when Sharif comes and says, I'm traveling to Morocco, a little part of me cringes. And a little part of me wants to tell him, no, don't go. Because I'm scared of everything. That's part of the authoritarianism, is I'm scared of everything. I'm scared of any experience. I always want the safety measures. I always want that, so I affirmatively, very hard, keep my mouth shut, and I don't ask him where you're going to sleep, how you're going to eat. I don't ask. Because I'm fighting the authoritarianism, the impact of authoritarianism. So that is I think, a critical step that all of us. Second, and this is, know that especially in the United States, the amount of power you have is directly proportional to what you invest in this power venture. How much power you have depends on how much this is the logic. It's quite simple. In the same way that don't expect to live in a nice house with nice furniture unless you've paid the bills. You'll go to jail if you try to live in a nice house with nice furniture and you haven't paid the bills. You have to pay the bills. Well, power in the United States works the same way. It's like buying a house and furniture. You've put in the money, you get out the power. You didn't put in the money, and this is a very important step, because somehow we think, I still have Muslims today that think that the response to Islamophobia is that we need to explain Islam to them. Are you insane? Are you nuts? Do you think these people just simply need a better class to learn about Islam? They know about Islam more than you will ever know about Islam. Because it is a matter of power dynamics. It's not a matter of epistemology and sources. The libraries are full of wonderful scholarship about Islam that gets ignored all the time. But why is the scholarship produced and never disseminated? Because of the lack of power. And why is the power not existing? Because the resources, the investment of resources is not there. There was a final point, but I blanked out. I thought it was an important point, but maybe it will come to me, inshallah. Okay, shall we go to?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so, okay, yeah. Rami, can you take care of how you handle the questions?
There's one question there, there's one question there, one question here, one at the back.
This is my job.
I'm just helping
Taking
you
over
out.
my job. All right.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Very insightful discussion. I think we learned a lot. If you allow me, I'd like to share one observation from my visit to Israel. And then I have one question for Dr. Hashemi. So the observation is as follows. We were in Israel about 6, 7 years ago. We spent 2 weeks, and we were there, and as Dr. Abu Fadl says, we wanted to learn a lot about the plight of the Palestinians. So we were in Jerusalem, we were in the West Bank, and it was, of course, very depressing to see what was going on. The whole situation of Palestinians, a 60-year-old Palestinian man walking up to a 16-year-old Israeli soldier with a stain gun on her chest, allowing this guy, checking his papers, allowing him to go work in Israel or not that day. And if she decided he should not go, he had to go back, and there was no money for that day, or because he's a laborer, he's going to work in Israel. And many, many examples. So as Dr. Abu Fadl said, we wanted to go back and really learn from what the Israelis think about the Palestine situation. So we talked to a lot of people. And it culminated, Dr. Hashemi, as you were pointing out, into an editorial by the Jerusalem Post. Now, this is 7 years ago. And being a student of history, I read it very thoroughly, multiple times. And the article, editorial article in Jerusalem Post 7 years ago said the following. They said, we know we are occupiers, and we occupy the land. But we are in no hurry to let go of this. And the reason being, and I'm just quoting, paraphrasing, the reason being that we know that over the next few years, the Middle East map is going to change. And there will be an opportunity to create a greater Israel. And we want to wait, and we will be a part of that strategy. And when that happens, after that, we will decide what do we do with the occupied lands of Palestine. So it was very insightful for me to see 7 years ago that this is what they were thinking. Now, it turns out, as you were pointing out, Abraham Accords was so the strategy was there, and they executed the strategy through Abraham Accords #1. And then I think October 7 gave them another opportunity to go execute this strategy, which they're executing now. So the point of the observation was that this is not something that just happened. This is something they have been thinking about for years, and now they're doing it. So the question, Dr. Hashemi, for you is, from a political perspective, Dr. Abu Fadl has taught us, and we totally agree, the role that we have to play as an individual and what we have to do. But from a political perspective, you mentioned all the stuff going on in Washington, State Department, White House, and so on. The view seems to be that with one sole imperial power in the world, supporting all these dictators, and them having the financial and military support of the sole superpower, how does the dynamic change? That is the question. If you could please give some insight into your assessment, what happens over the next 5 years, 10 years?
So how does the dynamic change in terms of the superpower, the United States' support for these dictators pursuing their policies? How do we change that fundamental dynamic?
Yes.
That's a good question. It's a very important question. I think the way that we do it, I think we saw an example of how we do it in the context of the Arab Spring. One of the facts about history and the struggles for democracy, justice, human emancipation, is sometimes there are these unpredictable events that we can't foresee. It happens, it creates a political opening, and the challenge is to seize that moment. So if you know the origins of the history of the Arab Spring, it began with this young man in Tunisia by the name of Mohamed Bouazizi, who in the context of a deeply authoritarian state was humiliated, brutalized, engaged in an act of self-immolation, burned himself in front of a police station, and that sparked the Arab Spring. That created this opening, and there was a time when dictators started to fall, one after the other. It was incredibly sort of inspiring moment. I remember that moment in Tahrir Square in Egypt when it was announced that Mubarak had been deposed and people were gathered there, and it looked like there was an opening. So I think that gives us an insight into how do we how do we shift things? How do we shift the power dynamics? I think one answer to your question is that your positionality matters. The moral obligations and responsibility of American Muslims in terms of what they can do to break this equation is different than a poor man or woman in Gaza today, right? Because we're living in at least what's left of a democracy. We can still gather, we have a voice, we can mobilize resources. People on the other side of the world living in a horrific situation, they don't have the same opportunity. So you have to ask, where are you? What can you be doing? And that puts a unique, special moral burden on American Muslims. Because American Muslims here, generally speaking, there's a lot of rich American Muslims, very educated, a lot of affluence, a lot of wealth. What are they doing to shift this equation? Unfortunately, the answer is not very much. That's something that has to change. And let's not forget the moral obligation increases in the context of these horror shows, particularly in the case of Gaza, when we realize that one of the significant facts of this genocide is that these are US-made bombs that are being dropped on the people of Gaza and now Lebanon. You know, I think if there was a credible Muslim community that we sort of had the type of leadership that we desire and aspire to, in other words, if we had many more Khaled Abou El Fadls in different mosques around the world, one of the things that I think would be a moral responsibility for American Muslims is to organize protests every single day outside of those arms manufacturers' factories. We're not going to let protests throw your life down on the line. We're not going to allow these arms to leave that factory to go to Gaza because we know what the consequences are. This is the type of mobilization that we need at this moment. It's not happening. The fact that what I'm suggesting here is not even on the radar screen of American Muslims suggests how deep the problem is. So I think the answer to your question is we have to, there's a lot of things we can be doing and should be doing before a moment of opportunity emerges like another Arab Spring. One of it is, I think, planning, getting to know each other. One of the ways you challenge authoritarian regimes is you try and build cross-ideological coalitions of people from different constituencies who have a common goal, democracy, rejecting authoritarian. These are things that we should be doing now, meeting with people. And so I think these are national struggles that have to happen within countries. I think they have to be bolstered by, movements in the United States, by Muslims, but in coalition with other people, our sisters and brothers in the American Jewish community, particularly the young members who've been very vocal and outspoken during this Gaza genocide moment, other civil society organizations. So there's a lot that we have to be, working on. It would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that, we are, less than a month away from an election in this country. And unfortunately, the choice is between bad and much worse. And so we don't have a lot of good options here. This is a moment for moral reflection to figure out, because I think if the United States were to change, right, I was very optimistic the last election and the 26th election, because it looked like Bernie Sanders had a chance of winning. I think if Bernie Sanders was the president now, we wouldn't be seeing this horror show. I think Arab dictators and Muslim repressive regimes would be very upset. That was a moment, it passed. It looked like he had a chance, I think that's a movement that we have to get involved with and build on it. Because I think if we can change the policies of this government here, and it's a big task, it's not going to happen anytime soon, then I think decisions that are often made in this country by the United States can have huge consequences for people on the other side of the world as to whether they win or they lose or they live or they die, right? If we had credible leadership here. And so, this is a conversation that we can have right now, but in a month from now, Donald Trump could be our president. And we're in a completely different world. And dictators in the Arab and Islamic world will be celebrating, so will Netanyahu, and so will Putin. And so, it's a very precarious moment, but we can't predict what's going to happen in this election. I think you have to get involved, and I'm happy to say more in terms of how Muslims should be voting in this moment. But these are the things that have to happen. There's no magic formula here. That's my point. What's your positionality? Where are you located? What are you doing with your resources? Do you understand these problems? Are you trying to change them? Muslims aren't the only people who face this colonial moment of subjugation. Other groups in history have mobilized and organized and fought heroic struggles. There's lessons that we can learn from them as well. I'll stop there.
I want to add something. Okay, we get myself in trouble, but it's halas. This is the effect of the genocide is that we just have to be very. I remember one of the, just like the mentioning Bernie Sanders. There was this moment where a lot of Muslims had to decide whether they are supporting Bernie Sanders or not. And at the time I was in LA, and I remember a conversation with some Muslims. They said, brother, we can't support Bernie Sanders because he is pro-gay rights. And this is exactly the type of crippled thinking, right? it's not a coincidence. Have you noticed that when in the Gaza protests, Muslim women are far more active and involved than Muslim men? Now, this is the effects of authoritarianism. The effect on the male ego and the male how withdrawn and crippled that male ego is. Now, the problem though is that because you mentioned cross-ideological reaches, when we in the Muslim community come and say, no, we can't work with this person or this party because they're too liberal. We can't work with this because they're Shia. We can't work with... It's a non-starter. Then the base is broken. And if the base is broken, there is no potentiality of accumulating any type of power, leave alone leveraging power. So to me, people like that want to start the conversation, for instance, before we can work together, first we have to agree that women should cover their hair, are betraying the Palestinian cause and are in fact complicit in the genocide. That type of thinking is the problem.
Thank you. Speaking of books, during the last week, a very well-known author has been making the rounds and talking about, I'm speaking of Ta-Nehisi Coates. He is an American author. He historically has written about race relations in the US, but his latest book is called The Message. I don't want to read too much into the title, but The Message, and it highlights the parallels between how his parents were raised in the Jim Crow South and what he saw when he went to Palestine for a literary festival, and what he saw and experienced with his own eyes, and what he very clearly and forcefully billed as nothing less than segregation and apartheid in Palestine. And my question to you all is, do any of you have relationships with Ta-Nehisi Coates? Is he someone that you speak to? Is he someone that you know? And can you comment on his book and the statements that he's made?
I'm happy to comment on it
Yes.
because I'm following this story very closely. Just out of curiosity in the audience, how many people know who this person is that we're talking about? Oh, great. I'm pleasantly surprised. How many people have bought the book or plan to buy the book? Okay, not bad. So this is a major development, actually, in the American political debate over the question of Palestine. Because Ta-Nehisi Coates is a prominent African-American intellectual. He has a lot of cachet and influence. And then, as you said, he goes to Palestine and he sees what's going on, he reports back, and he does something that I think we can learn from in the context of this discussion on authoritarian. He took a risk. He didn't have to go out on a limb and speak out so forcefully and so passionately about apartheid in Israel and what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. That's a mark of distinction when you sort of, are willing to risk the backlash, and he's getting a lot of backlash, right? From all of the people who basically are supporting the genocide. How dare you draw analogies between, the history of African-American persecution in this country and what Israel is doing? The parallels are actually quite stunning, and he deserves full credit. So speaking of buying books, I'm glad to see so many hands were raised. I'm glad, Muslims should organize and invite Ta-Nehisi Coates to speak at their local mosque or community center. These are things that can be done and should be done. It just so happens that he lives in the same city that I live in. He's at Howard University. We have a Gaza lecture series that we've been running this year, bringing people in every other week, some big names. And so he's one of the people who we're hoping to bring next semester to speak about the book. And it's actually fascinating to see the impact that it's having. And I think these are important things to think about in the context of the first question that was asked, that these struggles for for political change have to be viewed over the long arc of history. So I see this sort of moment as, Ta-Nehisi Coates shifting the political culture in the debate, in a small way, but in a significant way, because he's opened a door here where it's very difficult to criticize him. And he's opening up a recognition of what's happening to Palestine to a huge audience who take him seriously. It's very difficult to criticize him. The other point that I would make about this that's relevant is that there's a boycott, sanctions, and divestment movement, which I strongly support in the context of Israel-Palestine, but there's something to be said about having young people or people who don't know anything about what's going on, going there and seeing it for themselves. That's what he did. And he came back and he said, oh my God, he actually said in one of the interviews, I can't sleep at night. It's so dramatic. We had a similar experience at my previous university. We had an exchange program with Hebrew University, and students would come and go. The vast majority of students that would go there would come back angry, politicized, and outraged over what they saw. And they wanted to get involved in Palestine activism. So that's something that has to be thought about in the context of the BDS movement. How do we sort of encourage people to go and see what's going on while not violating the policy of BDS? So I just wanted to applaud you for bringing up Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, his message. It's a moment to celebrate. It's a moment to sort of watch. It's actually quite reassuring to see all the supporters of genocide in Gaza here in the United States freak out, doing cartwheels of hysteria over how dare someone point out the parallels of human oppression that exist in the West Bank and what happened in the Jim Crow South. Buy the book, read it, try and bring the author. There's many other authors who are writing in this vein. Peter Beinart has a new book out about Jewish ethics and the crisis in Gaza. Pankaj Mishra has a new book coming out on this topic. And so, as Khaled said, buy the book. If you're not going to read it, leave it on the bus or put it in the library. But this helps authors like this sort of produce these types of books, and it does have positive effects.
I feel like I'm going to stumble through this, so it's more of a comment, and it probably is quite controversial, but I have a hard time with seeing everybody's kind of repulsion with what's going on in Palestine when everybody's been kind of asleep at the wheel with all the suffering that's been going on in the world for the last 20 years, increasingly at a rate that's unbelievable. The reason that Israel can slaughter and murder and do all sorts of things to the Palestinians is because they watched us as we just allowed the same thing to happen in Syria. They watched us as we allowed the same thing to happen to the Uyghur Muslims, that we just watched the US Olympics and had no problem with the Olympics, or with the United States participating in the Olympics in China. We watched the Tibetan Muslims get slaughtered. What's going on in India with the Muslims is abhorrent. We're not, and you talk about Bernie Sanders, he wouldn't even address the Syrian issue because it wasn't politically safe for him to do so. And I spoke with leadership in the Muslim, community, because I was very active at that time and had a lot of optimism at that time that honestly has dissipated a great deal since. Because of my conversation with one of the Muslim leaders during the Bernie Sanders campaign, where, I said, how can we talk to Bernie Sanders without putting the Syria issue on the table, without addressing that issue? Yes, my family is from Syria, and so yes, there is definitely an interest there, but I had the same passion for Bosnia, I had the same passion for the Uyghurs. We can't, as a Muslim community, feel so passionate about only one group of people and let everyone else suffer and be silent about it. And that's on a large scale. My offense to what happens in the homes and in the local communities is even greater. I get contacted by women as an attorney, I get contacted by women all the time who are oppressed in their home, by children who are oppressed in their home. When a woman dares to stand up for herself in the Muslim community, or when somebody like me goes and talks to the imam and says, we need to have an open discussion about these issues, I would get ostracized. Why, and by whom? By the people who are advocating for, freedom in Palestine, right? It's very aggravating that, our focus, we all come together when the issue is Palestine, and we should, but we should do the same exact thing in any scenario because the issue is not a land issue, it's a humanitarian issue. And when we feel like we can watch Muslims suffer, or any human being suffer in any part of this world, and as a Muslim community we don't get together and say this is wrong in any one of those scenarios, that just tells you that what's happening in Palestine is symptomatic of a disease that exists in our communities.
Let me just say very quickly, I completely share your sentiment and your frustration and the need for us to speak out about other human rights violations that are happening to other people around the world in all of the countries you mentioned. You didn't mention Sudan, but I'll mention that as well because it's a horrific situation. But I want to respectably push back a little bit on what you said in terms of why Palestine, why Gaza, and not these other countries. There's a critical difference, a critical moral difference that separates these different causes. And I'm saying this before I give you the answer. I'm saying this as someone who's very active on the Uyghur issue, very active in the struggle to support the democratic revolution in Syria. I spent a lot of time on those issues. I did a lot on Bosnia. But the difference between Gaza and all of the other cases is that in the case of Gaza, it's our tax dollars and our government that are sending the bombs to drop on the children of Gaza. The difference let me finish. The difference is in the context of Syria, the United States wasn't sending bombs to Bashar al-Assad to drop on. Russia and Iran were doing that. So we have no control, direct control over Russia or Iran. We have a lot of control over what our tax dollars is doing, what our elected representatives are doing. And what they're doing in the context of Gaza is at the end of July, they invited Benjamin Netanyahu to speak at a joint session of Congress where he got 61 standing ovations and a blank check for more weapons. We're not sending weapons to the People's Republic of China to persecute the Uyghurs. There's a lot that we could be doing on the Uyghurs. I favor a boycott of Chinese products on moral grounds. But the difference with Gaza and the difference with what's happening in Israel and Palestine is that there's a fundamental ethical principle that you are much more responsible for actions that you can change and that you can influence versus those actions which you have less influence over. We have a lot of influence over Israel. In fact, Israeli generals have said if the arms just stopped flowing to us, we couldn't prosecute the war in Gaza. The same calculation and equation unfortunately doesn't apply in the other cases. But let me just say, because you're a Syrian and I was very involved in the Syrian revolution, my biggest criticism of US policy in Syria is why they didn't intervene to stop the genocide when they could have. When those planes were flying over Syria and Obama basically said, I don't give a shit. I was very involved in sort of an intervention that would stop that mass slaughter. It didn't happen, but I think there's a clear moral distinction that we have to make here based on those ethical principles. And yeah, Bernie Sanders, I agree. Look, we don't live in a perfect world, right? Bernie Sanders was very disappointing on Syria. But he's been pretty good, except, for a few moments. I don't want to get into details. But all things considered, he's very vocal on Israel-Palestine. Had he been the president, I think he would have done things that could have made a difference. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. And we don't have a lot of choices, right? So this is the world that we live in. So the question that you raise is a very important one because it often gets brought up. But I think if you think more deeply, ethically, about how we as Americans can and should think about our moral responsibilities over all of this suffering that we're seeing in the world, yes, we should be outspoken about all of those cases. But in the case of those events, those atrocities, those genocides that we are directly complicit in, and that the Biden administration, and I predict the Harris administration and Trump administration will continue doing, that level of moral responsibility, since it's all done by the United States, and if there would be a change in policy in this government, that suffering in Gaza would stop. That elevates, I think, the situation of Gaza at a much higher moral level for those of us who care about Islamic ethics.
Can I just make 3 quick points here, if you allow me? So one, I think there are 3, I would say, levels of thinking about this. One is like let's say morally, theoretically speaking, yes, every sovereign counts, and that's true, and we should always be, consistent. And I think all the panelists here are on the same page. And yeah, also when we speak to society, when we talk in the media, yes, we always talk about the suffering everywhere, and everywhere counts. Every human being counts, and ومن قتل مسلما فكان من قتل الناس جميعا من قتل نفسا بغير نفس فكأنما قتل الناس جميعا. So when you kill a human being, like you kill the species of a human being. So that's just one point. So yeah, I agree on that level. However, on the other points, the second point is, I think the difference between some suffering and, like politically speaking, like, is that it's the difference between what I talked about, like the first independence struggle and the second independence struggle, which is the independence from the direct colonizers and the independence from the other colonizers, the agents and the, you know, the allies and you know, the clients. So that's the second thing. And the third point that I want to make is, I totally agree with Nader. It's like on a strategizing level, however, yes, there's a big difference. Like, of course, we always should talk, you know, in the same breath about all of these suffering, all these. We should not distinguish or, you know, be inconsistent about like how a human being counts, and it's all suffering of this ummah. But on a strategizing level, it's always, I would say, there's always a margin for people to maneuver to see what's more impactful, what is we can make a difference more, and what point we make first, how to prioritize things over things, and that's just part of what even fuqaha called masalih, and you know, يعني المفاسد and the balances and how to balance things over things and prioritize things. That doesn't mean necessarily that what you prioritize is more important per se, but maybe is more impactful, and you have more a chance of making an impact and, you know, difference on the ground. So again, yeah, that may be, and sometimes fairly interpreted as like, oh yeah, our suffering is less important, and we can be just thrown under buses as for example, a Syrian community or a Syrian, you know, suffering. But that's, you know, that's not true, and maybe it's on our shoulder also to prove a lot of times that it's not the case.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khair. I'm reflecting about today's session in relation to what Sheikh Khaled said yesterday about the battle of awareness. And the thing I noticed with some of our communities is that there's an aspiration we have towards the West. And when we live in or come from authoritarian cultures, there's an admiration for Western cultures, and there's an admiration for Western democracy. And my question is, how do we debunk the myth of Western democracy for our community, particularly in North America, where these democracies are on stolen land, with stolen people and stolen resources, and that's how these democracies are built, and are directly reliant on the authoritarian regimes of our own land. So how do we debunk the myth of Western democracy so that we are no longer susceptible to colonization through the process of aspiration towards Western democracies? Thank you.
Want to take that?
Yeah.
No.
You wrote in the
Yeah,
book.
okay. You want to take it?
No, I was.
So the question is, how do we debunk the myth of Western democracy to acknowledge that in many ways it's a mirage because these democracies have been built on stolen indigenous land. Is that correct? Thank you for raising the question of indigenous rights. You know, I think it's one of these ignored themes that have been ignored for a long time. It's slowly getting back. I think I would break up the premise of your question into several different sections. Yes, the United States, Canada, Australia, these are settler colonial states that were built on colonized land. There's no doubt about that. For a very long time, that fact was not recognized. I remember when I was growing up in Canada, we didn't hear anything about the history of genocide. Now when you go to Canada, it's now de rigueur, it's sort of commonplace, it's expected. Before you stand up and give any public talk, you sort of begin with a preamble statement. I want to recognize that we are on stolen land here of the Iroquois, the Mohawk, etc., and we acknowledge their suffering. And there's been a sea change from when I was growing up in Canada. Two things can be true at the same time. You can acknowledge the fact that the founding of the United States and Canada and other countries were founded against the backdrop of genocide. But you can also acknowledge the fact that these societies have transformed themselves over the years into much more inclusive, much more respectful societies than they were when they were first founded. One example of this is there's a greater recognition for genocide right now in, for example, Canada. That democracy in the West is a work in progress. I think for people who came here and immigrants, as my parents did, it was largely a positive experience. It was largely a case where they were fleeing a repressive tyranny in the Islamic world, and they came to Canada. So if you ignore for a moment and you think about what has Canada, for example, because I know that country better, what has Canada accomplished in the context of its own history? It became a country that ignored the genocide of its indigenous populations and was able to create, all things considered, a society, warts and all, that was much more, I think, in keeping with Islamic values than most Muslim countries today. For example, freedom of religion, universal health care, unions, a certain representative democracy that's sort of not ideal and it's certainly flagging and weakening, but at least some sort of representation. I think the point that I think needs to be made here is that all of these societies that are founded, they have their dark moments. The challenge of, I think, a good and just society is to be able to reflect, to realize things that have happened in the past, and then to try and you can't turn the clock back, but at least you can recognize, you can teach new generations, you can have a policy of restitution, you can educate new generations of people into these dark moments of your past, even when it has to do with genocide, and try and create a better future for the existing generation. So I think, all things considered, Canada has a lot to offer for it, but I wouldn't simply, I'm very uncomfortable with simply saying that, look, because of the founding genocidal moment of a particular state, that these societies can't improve and can't get better. Now, we had slavery in this country, right? Slavery ended. There was Jim Crow. Jim Crow gradually receded. We have a civil rights movement. I think the situation of African Americans now is not ideal. It's far from perfect, but it's much better than it was, several generations ago. So societies aren't static, aren't in motion, and that's how I would answer your question.
Thank you. Can I add?
You got to ask him.
Just quickly,
go ahead.
I feel embarrassed.
No, please.
Sheikh and Nader wrote extensively on democracy and Islam and all these things. But just quickly, Sheikh mentioned yesterday the rise of colleges, George Maqdisi. And when we speak about democracy, I'll just bring it to purely theoretical level, which is to say that the idea of democracy should not be uncomfortable with it. The idea is, I don't want to say claiming back some of these principles, but just one aspect of this, for example, George Maqdisi mentioned, is the civil society aspect. I remember when George Maqdisi spoke about how colleges in Islam developed and the idea of schools, and just quickly, how fuqaha and jurists developed in these schools that were independent even from a state-like institutions, because they were no state as we know it today, like a modern state, but jurists developed their own thinking and discussion in schools were completely endowed within an endowment that is independent. It was economically independent. It was politically independent. They produced, compilations of thinking, rulings, discussions, ideas, and huge literature of books about jurisprudence, about other aspects of Islamic sciences in these schools. And there were scholarships, even grants. This is one aspect that was not even imagined in Europe or any part of the world. And that kind of thinking where you have people develop their own thinking on a society level without the influence of the state. The state does not make or create or produce this kind of thinking. It is independent, it is from the people. This was the first moment of the idea of civil society that made, by the way, Usuli Institute existed. That's why many societies, many organizations around the world possible, and made many institutes, think tanks, and you name it, possible. The idea of having these colleges, institutions, jurists to check and have this oversight and to have almost, let's say, I wouldn't say like almost monopoly over what we call it now legislation. That is, it's kind of like it's kind of what I think Asif al-Quraishi called the separation of realms instead of separation of powers. That was like pre-modern Islamic way of separation of powers that we know today in democracies around the world. Separation of realms, where the realm of legislation is independent from the state. It checks on the state. The state's role was to apply what the jurists' rulings are and what the jurists produced. They had that kind of role, which is legislating for not just the state, by the way, for society to apply directly without even the interference of the state. That concept by itself, adopted by many democracies now around the world, and is just an essential part of democracy, was just by Muslim ideas. So I don't want to be like really, pushing back against some of the great ideas that even Muslims in history, even classical Muslims, didn't have problem, for example, embracing ideas from the Greeks or from the Indians or from, when they see something more fitting to Islamic principles and ideas. I don't know if I answered anything, but.
Hi, thank you. This was a really great segue. Everyone's questions and comments. So I have kind of some questions that articulate between kind of my lived experience and also some more academic kind of conceptual, how to translate this, I guess, into my mind. I remember Sheikh in one of his khutbahs or tafsir was saying his mind is like a forest of confusion. And so I, converted to Islam later in life after completing my doctorate, but I am kind of the opposite of that student, right? Where I was always told, do what you love and the money will follow. And, I have a PhD and a ton of work experience and have been dedicated to social justice and really found that, within my understanding of Islam, there was that understanding of the dedication to social justice. However, I was told, do what you love and the money will follow. And that was not true even before I converted to Islam, right? And so, I think some of these conceptual contradictions, like I was actually working on a Native American reservation when my background is in anthropology and public health, when I converted to Islam. And I think that like in other it's hard to speak as an academic, right? Because you can't avoid contradictions. And I remember like some of my colleagues, like in South Africa, I worked a lot in South Africa. One of them said, yeah, I like went into academia because I like to muddy the waters. I like the complexities. I like digging in. And so the minute you speak, you start to contradict something maybe that you said like earlier. And so I remember like in earlier, I don't know, videos or something, I saw something about, at least from the European point of view, like the Muslim world and Islam was seen as being very resistant and difficult to colonize, right? And there was like a particular kind of focused effort on how do we strategize to conquer and colonize Muslims. And at the same time, I agree. I see a very colonized, like colonial mentality. If you haven't read Frantz Fanon, right? You guys say, yeah, Muslims don't read, and in general, my students don't read. Nobody reads. But yeah, I mean, there's the concept of the colonial elite, and I think there's a couple of contradictions that I'm struggling to understand, and maybe you guys can clarify it, or maybe we're just going to keep muddying the waters more. Like are we, particularly, is the Islamic kind of paradigm, if you can say there is one, particularly susceptible to colonization, or are we, maybe better equipped if we actually dig in deeper, right, to our deen? Is that a source of strength and resilience? I think the other, so also, I guess the kind of irony of like investing, where yes, there is a group of very affluent Muslims, but I think a lot of them are either the colonial elite that have been, there's a filter, that have been the ones who have been, able to come here, or they are the ones who have that colonized mentality and have, been able to navigate the system in a way that I have not. And so actually, I have had continual underemployment in U.S. academia. I'm currently virtually unemployed. I've worked in many, many, many universities, including Rutgers University, most recently at University of Arizona. But they're contracts, short term, and in general, I'm basically a starving academic, which is a general. So the question is, and I don't, I think on my social media and stuff, I'm again, for a long, long time, have been supportive of social justice issues, including the Palestinian cause. But it's not something that I'm like showing up to work with a keffiyeh or something like that. But, okay. I think that the question for me is, how do we navigate these contradictions, right? And I think that we have a select, elite that, alhamdulillah, you guys have been empowered and have some security, right? But how do we disseminate that to the masses, right? And how do we get more people like you in these positions?
I just wanted to take one thing that she said, Khaled, and maybe you could sort of answer it because it's foundational to why we're gathered here. She said, is there something about the Islamic paradigm that makes it more susceptible to colonialism? Mm-hmm. And are there any resources from within our deen, within our religious tradition that we can use to fight against this, paradigm that makes us susceptible to colonialism? I thought that was a really good comment and question to you.
And also another question is about it's like susceptibility versus resistance. So,
no, it's actually it's not. There's no contradiction, and it's not an issue of muddying anything. Definitely, it is true. Colonialism found Islamic societies harder to colonize. When you think of what the experience of colonialism was, indigenous cultures in South America, for instance, in a lot of African areas, in a lot of areas in Africa, where they completely erased the indigenous language, completely destroyed the indigenous religions, and completely successfully exported Catholicism and so on. And but the power of Islam to resist actually was intimately interconnected to what Abdullah and Nader were talking about, and that is strong Islamic civil societies. That indeed, one of the things we were just talking about this yesterday, when in Mauritania, where you discover that as an act of resistance to colonialism, tribes would hide texts, Islamic texts, underground in the desert, because they knew that colonialism persistently pillaged. I mean, look at Islamic manuscripts. I mean, look at the collection at Oxford or at Harvard or at Yale or at Princeton or even UCLA. We have 6,000 manuscripts. All of this is pillaged. It's now, and Islamic societies became susceptible to colonialism only when civil society was persistently weakened, when the autonomy and independence of Muslim intellectuals, and especially the Muslim Awqaf. The story of Awqaf is critical history. Only when that story of Awqaf is amazing, because colonialism struggled to control the Islamic Awqaf, and so many Muslims went to prison, were tortured, and were killed resisting the attempt of colonialism to control the Awqaf. Even in Israel, there's their systematic effort to control the Islamic Awqaf in Israel is an entire story in itself. There's a good book about it, but many more historians need to work on it. So there is no contradiction, but the problem is now, where the client state has successfully now nationalized and controlled the Islamic Awqaf. The Islamic Awqaf no longer in any real way exist. Right. And so we are at this historical moment where you as a Muslim and your child as a Muslim and my child as a Muslim grows up. It is not part of, it used to be that part of the consciousness of any educated Muslim is that you grow up and you are constantly thinking of the waqf. What is my relationship? What is my duty towards creating a waqf? Why? Because the waqf, that endowment, is going to take care of orphans, is going to take care of poor people, is going to take care of refugees, is going to take care of displaced people, is going to take care of students. All students, idea of students having to pay for their education rather than an endowment, Awqaf paying for their education, is a fairly new one. Right. And all the professorial positions in Islamic history were funded through Awqaf, private Awqaf. Right. So now all of that was lost, and your child and my child will grow up, and the imperative of a waqf is very alien to them. They don't, part of decolonizing is indeed restoring that consciousness. Often I'm often told by my family that stop being mean to rich people. That you're alienating them. How do you want them to support us if you're always insulting them? What is And they're trying to get me to be better natured and more friendly and all that. But do you know my attitude comes from exactly that classical traditional education? Is that when I tell a rich person they have an obligation to create a waqf, I am not asking them for a favor, I'm demanding a right. I'm demanding a right. And that's where the Islamic culture gives you the values to indeed resist colonialism.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, everyone. I know I've made a lot of enemies because I haven't been able to pick on everyone for their questions. I'm just so sorry. We're out of time. Thank you so much to Dr. Alaoudh, Dr. Abou El Fadl, Dr. Hashemi for a wonderful panel that was really insightful, illuminating, edifying. Alhamdulillah. And I also want to thank the audience. You know, you started off disappointing me in the beginning with some of the questions that I was getting, or the answers to the questions that I was asking, but you've redeemed yourselves, alhamdulillah. Those were amazing questions, really very thoughtful, very challenging questions. And, you know, round of applause to everyone for your contributions and for being able to navigate such a challenging subject, alhamdulillah. We're going to have lunch right now, and yeah, please help yourselves, and we will then resume the programming, inshallah.